Good afternoon, everyone. First of all, let me say it's a real pleasure to be at a internationally recognized business school. I've spent a lot of my adult life being associated with business schools. I was the dean of the Haas School of Business, also the dean of the London Business School. So I have a lot of admiration for business education, for the students, for the professors, for what they add to the world of business and to the world of the economy. So it's a pleasure to be at ESMT. It's also a great pleasure to be at American Academy in Berlin. Some of you may know of this. It's a wonderful think tank out in Lake Wannsee. They have 10 to 12 visiting scholars each semester. So you're invited to come for 4 months and do research on a topic of your choice. I use that as an introduction because the way I came to the American Academy was through an increasing interest in the effects of automation on work. We live in a society which is changing rapidly through technology. We can talk about the changes in our personal life, in our social life, in our privacy, in the way we do finances. My interest is the effect of technological change on work. I started to be involved in this project through the World Economic Forum just about 4 years ago now, and increasingly got interested in what a large, competitive, global economy like Germany was doing to moderate the effects, the disruptive effects, the change effects of rapidly changing technology on employment, on skills, on sectors, on wages. I thought let's take a look at an economy that is right in the midst of this technological revolution, is globally competitive, is big, so that the lessons, lots of times when I talk about this topic and I'll mention something about Singapore or Denmark, my US colleagues say, but those are just small countries. So they say, yeah, but what about Germany? It's a big country. So my choice of Germany came out of my interest in the topic. And I've been here for what will amount to 4 months, and I've had a tremendous opportunity to build a network of scholars in Germany who are working on this issue. At Hertie, at Humboldt, at Freie University, at other universities across Germany. And this was the beginning of a multi-year research project. So I want you to understand where it fits in, because the results I will present here are an introduction to ongoing research. And I'd be very interested in your reactions and thoughts to it. I think I have about 45 minutes. I don't want to overdo it. I want to leave time for questions. So I think I'll divide my presentation into essentially 3 parts. The first part will talk a little bit about what economists over time, over history, across countries have concluded about the effects of automation on employment, on wages, on income distribution. So we know enough from history, and we know enough from what's been going in the past 30 to 40 years. We actually know a fair amount about the effects already. And then the second part of my remarks will actually say, okay, let's think forward a little bit. And thinking forward, I'm going to use a lot of work from McKinsey Global Institute. For those of you who may know of this, McKinsey, the consulting firm, has a non-profit research institute called MGI, McKinsey Global Institute. It has quickly become, in the decade or so it's been around, one of the major research institutes in the world, and all of its material is online. So when I refer to something here, if you want to pursue that, you go online, it's absolutely free. So I will talk a little bit about McKinsey and future. And then the last part, I want to talk about some of the interesting policy differences or policy lessons or institutional lessons that Germany holds for other advanced industrial economies, including the US. I should say, again, as an introduction, I've spent a lot of my life in public policy. I did have the honor of advising President Clinton and President Obama on economic issues. So I always come to my topics with a policy angle. I can say right now, I'm pretty sure that none of the policy lessons I'm learning here are going to be taken up by the current federal government in the United States. That's not going to happen. But there are many big states in the United States, and I'm working pretty closely with the governor of California. The governor of California is very interested in the kinds of policies we're going to talk about. And California is, by most measures, the fifth, sixth largest economy in the world. It's a very big part of the U.S. economy. So if we can get some of these things going in California, they might ultimately have an effect on policy at the national level. So those are some introductory comments. Here's a robot. I have this picture up here because I visited a really interesting place, and I would encourage any of you who are thinking of taking a trip to Dubai. So Dubai has set up what they call a Ministry of Economic Possibilities. I'm not kidding. That's the name of the ministry, Ministry of Economic Possibilities. And they have taken over what was once, when I first visited Dubai 25 years ago, one of the first very high-end malls where you could get Chanel or Dior or everything. They've taken the whole thing and they've created it into a wonderful accelerator space. So there are lots of teams from around the world who go to Dubai, get accepted by the accelerator, work on an idea, and then when they get the idea in shape to say, okay, we're to start up, they walk down the hall in this mall to one room where all of the ministries that you have to get sign off for are located in that one room. So you literally just go down the hall and register your business and get sign-offs and you're done. So that's a very interesting model, I think, So anyway, I thought we're going to talk about technology, but I did think it was important in the data I'm looking at and in economics in general, we need to be cognizant that technological change is a major driver of what's going on, but so are a lot of other things. And I just put them down here. Demographics are extremely important. In Germany, we know that the labor force size is going to decline, and we know that it's an aging population. My colleague, Hal Varian, who's the chief economist at Google, has a lovely slide presentation about technological change, and he says that bots and tots are the issue, that bots are going to replace the elderly, but tots are going to also replace the elderly, so it's bots and tots. Anyway, demographics really matter to the labor market. Globalization, I just want to say in the U.S., and probably true here, economists debate a lot. Is globalization the reason why there has been a decline in manufacturing employment, or is it technological change? Is globalization and outsourcing and competition from low-wage countries the reason for wage slowdowns in advanced industrial countries, or is it technological change? So I want to argue that technology and globalization, it's very hard to disentangle the two. You cannot have the sophisticated supply chains that drive globalization. You cannot have factories pieced out around the world in one organization without very sophisticated technology. So I would say technological change, or sometimes I say technology-enabled globalization. Climate change. You know, if we're talking about the future of work over the next 15 to 20 years, we better also be talking about the climate in which that work occurs. So sometimes I'm in these discussions where people are saying, oh, I think that by 2030, 24% of jobs are going to be dislocated in some sense. And then I say, yeah, okay, fine. What's going to be the environmental situation in 2030? And are we going to have to move significant numbers of people to climate change adaptation? I think, for example, in my state of California right now, where you've probably have been reading about all the tremendous fires, that is climate change. And California is going to have to change its infrastructure policy, and its businesses are going to have to change their investment policy to do much more adaptation to the reality of climate change. So if you're talking about employment in 2030, you need to talk about climate change. Gender roles I just mentioned because that's ongoing around the world, including in Germany. So again, technology, how is it going to affect roles and occupations that have traditionally been held by women? Genderized roles, childcare, nurses, office assistants. So gender is the impact of technology on gender or gender change on technology, I think you have to consider. And then finally, in much of the technology space, you have the development of very, very large firms. They have a lot of market power because of first mover advantages and network effects. It is very hard to contain their share of markets. They have dominant shares of the markets that they have developed. That's an issue. That's an issue for policy. It's an issue for everything, because the whole theory of markets doing well is a theory based on competition and entry of new competitors into marketplaces. And in these kinds of sectors, it is just very difficult. And as you know, many of you probably know, what tends to happen is the dominant player in a technology space will buy up the new entrants as opposed to allow them to flourish to become competitors. So those are all things that just keep them in mind as you're thinking about the economy and some of the things that I'm saying. Paradox of the present. Right now, and this is certainly the case in Germany and certainly the case in the US and in many of the other industrial countries, hey, the labor market looks great. Labor markets are tight. Employment to population ratios are high. The unemployment rate in Germany and the US is at historic lows. Tight labor markets, and of course the tightness of the labor market is generating wage growth, absolutely generating wage growth. I happened to look at the Bundesbank prediction for next year. They're predicting wage growth on average of about 3% in Germany, a unit labor costs of around 3% in Germany, because they're predicting that labor productivity is going to be essentially flat. So that's an amazing situation. Tight labor markets. Yet, if you go around the world and ask people, hey, how do you feel about robots? What's your sense? Is technology going to help you with your jobs or hurt you with your jobs? You got, depending on the country, 65 to 90% of those surveys say robots will take over many of the jobs performed by humans, including the one that I'm doing. And then my last point here is if you go through history, yeah, you could see there's ample reason for concern. There is ample reason for concern. Technological change brings a lot of disruption. Disruption is costly to individuals. It's costly to firms. It's costly to communities. It's costly to sectors. And the advance may take some time. So the benefits of the change may be 10 years out, but the disruption is right now. I put down here the Luddites were right. I don't know, in economic history, it's very famous that there was a group in Britain's Industrial Revolution that fought against technology. They were right from their point of view. The technology displaced them. It displaced the guilds that were the Luddites' representation of their skill set. So we know that there's disruption. This is just showing that we have the same headlines from the 19th century, from the 20th century, from the 21st century. This is March 2019. Are robots coming for you? So I'm sure there are similar news clips and news reports throughout Germany. So economists have studied this now, and I think it's good to start all this and thinking about what might happen to Germany and Germany's policy response. What do we know from the past? We do know stuff from the past, and stuff from the recent past, from the last 30 to 40 years. We know some things. Okay. So first of all, there's no evidence that technology creates unemployment. There's no long-run technological unemployment. So John Maynard Keynes worried about this. What technology does is it changes the pattern of employment. It changes the skills required. It changes the sectors. It changes the firms. It changes how things are done, but it does not result in prolonged technological unemployment. There may be some transitional unemployment along the way, absolutely. But the long run, no. And the second thing we know about technology is it generates significant productivity growth. Sometimes it takes a while to show up. One of my favorite professors in my life, I had the honor to have Robert Solow as one of the early Nobel laureates be a professor of mine at MIT many years ago. And he actually had a comment about the computer revolution, ICT. He said, the productivity effects were missing in the data for decades. It didn't show up. It took a while for the technology to be absorbed by companies and organized into the company's processes to really see the productivity effects. So we know technological change is a major driver of productivity. We know that. Takes some time. So in a recent study that I mentioned there, Otor and Solomon's productivity growth, they look at productivity growth and they say, okay, does it take it sector by sector or country by country? Do we see, is it displacing employment or is it supporting employment? Well, on the argument that there's no technological unemployment, but there is productivity gains, what they find is exactly that. The productivity is there from the investments in technology, and the employment growth is also there. And so that is a very recent study showing that. However, the history also shows, as I've said, that the automation, technological change is going to change occupations. It's going to dislodge existing occupations, create new ones. There are dislocation and transition costs associated with that. And then the last one, because there's a distributional element to consider here. History indicates that the productivity benefits of technological change, they're there. We can see them in the past. We can see them now. Often take decades. Okay. It takes a while to show up. That's Robert Solow's observation. And the eventual beneficiaries are not necessarily those who bear the initial costs. So this is important. Probably true here, certainly in the US. If you're with technological optimists, if you're with the high-tech community, all they do is talk about the benefits of disruption. Okay, disruption. We're disrupting everything. We're redesigning transportation. We're redesigning healthcare. We're redesigning retail. We're redesigning everything. Disruption is positive. Disruption from the point of view of the people being disrupted is not positive. Okay, let's be serious here. It's not positive to the workers. It's not positive to the firms being disrupted. It's not positive to the communities being disrupted. And oftentimes, if there's social unease that is associated with this disruption, it's not going to be positive for the political or social stability of the system either. So I think it's just important to make that point. Oh, here we go. Something about the last 40 years of technology. So this is saying, okay, there are some particular features of the technological change of the past 40 years, and this is going to continue for the future. Okay, so this trend we see. It is skill biased. Okay, what does that mean? The technology tends to want to work with people who have complementary skills. Those tend to be highly skilled, tend to be university educated, tend to be technicians and scientists, tend to be management, tend to be, whereas it displaces or disrupts people doing routine tasks in the middle. So a perfect example here, of course, is manufacturing. Now, we can debate and should debate to what extent manufacturing is routine. But if you actually look around the world, including in Germany, what you'll see is that over the past 40 years, where you've had the biggest penetration of, say, automated robotic systems, that has led to significant increases in the productivity of manufacturing, but a significant decrease in employment in manufacturing. But that's exactly what the skill bias would suggest. That's exactly what the skill bias would suggest. Skill bias leads to what's called the polarization of labor markets, measured as a share of high-skilled jobs and occupations in total employment. So you sort of take a picture. I'll show you a picture, then maybe I can talk through the picture. So this shows polarization. This is employment in the millions in 16 European countries from 2000 to 2018, using a very standard international classification of occupations that are middle, high, and low. And what you could see is polarization says you're going to get growth at the bottom because a lot of routine jobs at the bottom are actually not, they have to be done by humans. A kind of simple thing would be kind of janitorial services or a lot of personal services. Machines can't do it as well. There's a human interaction, doesn't require a lot of skill. So you see those growing. High skilled, this is where you got the engineers, the scientists, the people who've been trained in apprenticeships in Germany to do highly technical tasks. Those are doing fine and they're growing. And then the middle skills. There's one point in another slide here. The jobs most at risk for automation are those in the 20th to the 80th percentile of the wage distribution. They are exactly what we think of middle class jobs for a middle class democracy. Okay, those are the ones that are most at risk. And I'll talk about that a bit more. Here's another picture of polarization. So another great source, if you're interested in this topic at all, besides McKinsey Global Institute, is the OECD. I would say they have done fantastic work. I was just at a session yesterday. They're introducing a new report on collective bargaining throughout the OECD and how labor organizations are dealing with technological change. So this is simple. All of those blue things going down, and you only see two going up there, and all these are all the advanced industrial countries or the members of the OECD. So right in the middle here, you got the OECD average. And it's basically saying between the mid 1990s and say 2010, depending upon the country, those downward blues say the share of the working adults in middle skills is declining. Everything is a decline. So in the German case, the EU, it's 11.9% decline in the share of working adults in middle skill. Okay. Germany's got some high skill. That's also part of polarization. If you're reducing the share in the middle, you are going to also see consistently some increase in the share at the top. So Germany has a 10% increase in the share of working adults in high skilled and about 12% decrease in the share of working adults in middle skills, and got a little bit of growth in the low skill area. Whereas I said, that's where you need kind of humans, robots and algorithms can't do the work. Okay, so, all right, so polarization is pretty accepted among economists and policymakers as something that has been occurring. So skill bias and polarization go together. And then the question is, what are the consequences of that? Should we do anything to try to change it? So this brings me just to one other thing about general before I go into some specifics. So polarization pulls apart the wage distribution. You got people at the top in high skills. They're gaining as a share of employment. Those are higher wages. You got people in the middle. Actually, those jobs are disappearing, and some of those middle jobs are disappearing. You got people at the bottom who are not yet disappearing to the same extent. What about the effects on income inequality or on income? So these are just some effects that have been observed, and we'll see some of this. One is it creates a gap between wage growth and labor productivity. So a standard argument among economists is over time, the rate of growth of wages, and let's say average, is driven by the rate of growth of labor productivity. So the more labor becomes productive, the greater the growth in the wages of workers. But it turns out that's actually not true if you have skill bias. If skill bias is taking out the middle, taking out those skills, the productivity gains and the wage gains they're going to disconnect. You're going to see the productivity gains outpacing the wage gains. And that is true in the advanced industrial countries to different extents, but you can see the general point. You can see the general point in the labor share of income or the capital share of income. Again, if you think about it as if the technology is over time reducing the either the wages or the number of workers, you're going to see a decline in the labor share of national income. There are some other effects here I won't go through, but the point is there are lots of ways in which the technology itself, the skill bias polarizing technology, can add to the income and wealth inequalities that we see in the advanced industrial countries. And there's a lot of debate, of course, about, well, maybe technological change is part of it, but maybe it's not the main thing. But I do think it's important to keep it in mind because the advanced industrial countries are all thinking about the impact of rising income and wealth inequality. And to the extent that technology plays a role, that's one of the contributors. It's only one. There are lots of others. Just show you a little picture here. I mentioned that one of the things we would predict from the skill bias polarization is that the share of labor income in national income would decline. The capital share would rise, the labor share would decline. And we see that different times in different countries. There's Germany is the dark purple line, I guess. The United States is the dotted yellow line. We got a measure for the whole economy, the business sector, which is a broad measure of the economy, but does include things like agriculture, and then the industrial sector, where you think that the strength of the German economy is. And here you see in this business sector one, you can see very clearly from 1970 to 2010, all of those labor shares of income are declining. They're all declining in all of these four countries and other ones too. This one's interesting because Germany actually in this one, which is the manufacturing strength of Germany, I would say the producing goods strength of Germany, the share does not start to decline until around 2000. By the way, I'll say something else here. One of the really difficult things about doing work on Germany, it's wonderful, I like it, is the fact that in this period of time, we had unification. And unification really, there's a unification effect in every chart, and trying to distinguish that effect from other effects is very hard. So I just want to make that clear. I understand. And part of what we're going to be trying to do in our work going forward is to actually try to distinguish whenever we can the unification effect from all the other things going on. So we'll see. We'll see. I guess I'm going to show you this one because I'm going to do this for Germany. I haven't done this yet. So, remember the general prediction that skill-biased automation, which polarizes the labor market, will drive down the labor share of national income. So this is for the U.S. from 1980 to 2012. So it's a different, you can see the downward trend. One of my colleagues who's done a lot of work on the on technological revolution has said, remember that small group of workers at the very top, the founder entrepreneurs, the people who actually develop successful new startups that become mega startups. Those people get paid labor income. And that labor income might actually be rising as a share of national income, even as that 20 to 80% group, their skills and occupations are being displaced. The people at the top 5, 10, 3% of the wage distribution, their wages are being pulled up because they're sharing in the profits of the enterprises. And so this is a fun one because if you look just at that, you don't have to look at this in detail, but if you look at that black line and look at that dotted blue line for the US, it's saying if you want to predict the share of the top 3% of workers in terms of wage growth, you will see that the best prediction for their share of national income is the profit share. They're actually taking profits home in the form of labor income. I think that's a really interesting one, and we're going to do that for Germany, so I just thought I'd put it there. this is kind of the segue to the next part of the talk, which is, okay, all these things that I've pointed out seem to be true historically and seem to be true over the last 30 years, and they are different they're different timing by country, they're different magnitudes, but the general trends are, I think, supported. So the different policies have any effect on this? Could they have any effect on this? Could different institutions have any effect on this? Does the fact that Germany has still a significant percentage of its workers under collective bargaining, or has works councils, or has apprenticeships, can that have any effect on this? Because it looks very different from the U.S. in all those regards. So we're now going on to policies and institutions. So let's see. Okay, so in order to do that, I want to project to the future now. Okay, so this is the past. And in order to say, can policies and institutions have any effect, let's think about the future. So in the future, I'm using McKinsey Global Institute. I worked on this study as a senior advisor. I still think it's one of the best studies out there, trying to assess the likely, there's a lot of uncertainty about this, but the likely trends in employment between now, their study was 2015 to 2030, caused by technological change, caused by skill bias, polarizing technological change, because that's in their model. Okay, so what did they find out? They asked the question, let's look at all the technologies currently available. So that was in 2016. There's some other ones that are available since then, right? And let's say they're technically able to do things. They may not do them because they may be costly. There may be a policy impediment to their doing it. The management may not know about it, but these are technically possible. Okay? So look at these numbers. About half of all of the work activities, this is around the world. Okay? So they did in developing and developed countries, have the potential to be automated. Now that is automated to some extent. Not completely automated, because actually less than 5% of current occupations around the world consist of activities that could be 100% automated. We could take out those occupations right now if someone decided it was economically sensible to do so. Okay? But 60% of occupations have at least 30% of their activities or tasks that can be automated. Well, that's pretty significant, because just think about what that would mean between now and 2030. Then how do you restructure these occupations? Do you restructure them so that the technology does a third of them? Do you have a third of the task just done by the technology? Do you have the technology working with the worker with the human enabled in the production process, so that 30% of what the person is doing is actually being done by a robot or an algorithm that he or she is working with? So lots of disruption here in terms of potential automatability. The things that are most at risk for significant automation right now are routine physical tasks. And I want to put predictable environments. Manufacturing is a key one. Manufacturing is a key one around the world. And routine cognitive tasks, collecting data, processing data. That's what a lot of people do. I mean, I do a lot of processing of data occasionally. In the U.S., the sectors that are most susceptible to automation, some of these sectors are going to be exactly the same for Germany. We're actually working with the MGI data now to pull out the German effects. But some sectors that are most susceptible to automation: transportation, manufacturing, retail trade, food and accommodation. Given the susceptibility, now then McKinsey had to make another assumption. They actually used decentralized histories of the pace of adoption of different technologies. And so they came up with a kind of midpoint estimate of the pace of adoption. They have a high-end estimate, low, so this is midpoint. Midpoint estimate of the pace of adoption of currently available automation technologies that can disrupt or displace work. And what they conclude is that between 2016 and 2030, 3% of all work hours in the U.S. have the potential to be automated away. People have to do something else. Not to say that they won't do something else, just have to do something else, do it differently. And 24% of the work hours in Germany. And for the U.S., right now, those activities account for about half of all working hours. That's a lot. So the disruption of half of all, where is disruption likely to occur? In the part of the economy where currently we have half of all working hours. So those are big effects. I think I'm not going to do this. I'll just say that this is an MGI slide. The only thing I want to point out here is McKinsey did ask the question between now and 2030. Remember I said that there's no long-run technological unemployment from technology, but there can be unemployment along the way. So they sort of said, in a society like Germany, where you have a declining labor force between 2016 and 2030, if I project future demand, if I project future spending from rising incomes of the population, if I make some assumptions about healthcare spending for the aging population, if I make some assumptions about investment in infrastructure, I know that's a big debated here, or energy or buildings, those are going to create more jobs. Okay, so there may be disruption along the way, but there's demand for those things that will pull workers into those jobs. Interesting up here is one called the market for previously unpaid work. Think about that as care for children and care for the elderly. If you made those paid jobs, you'd actually generate a lot of jobs in the future, because those are not jobs that are going to be likely automated away, but they would be jobs for people. So it depends upon where the demand for jobs comes from. And then just some jobs of the future, some things where we pretty sure that jobs, advanced is the advanced industrial countries, so that's what I'm dealing with today. Predictable physical, manufacturing down, office support down, professionals up, care providers up, construction up, if you believe those infrastructure things, managers and executives, educators, tech professionals, creatives. All I want to point out here is the rather dramatic difference between the skills of the jobs that are going to disappear and the skills of the jobs that are going to appear. I think a manufacturing worker and a creative, it's just, manufacturing, how does Germany sort of deal with the right apprenticeship programs, restructuring apprenticeships, so that they say, okay, the future things are more professional skills. We have to think about how to do that. One of my colleagues at Herté was telling me that there are now underway 3 new apprenticeship programs in accounting for ICT or technology industries. So 3 new specialized accounting apprenticeships, because you have to say, okay, if it's going to be more professionals and you need more accounting or you need more lawyers or something, but the skills are different. Okay, so that's just, I think, interesting. I think we've already done this. Overall, new jobs will require different skills and higher skills. And I've already made this point. Here's just a list of different things we've already talked about. The last point, polarization and the hollowing out of middle wage jobs are likely to continue. Occupations in the middle of the wage distribution, 20th to 80th percentile, have the highest risk of being automated. And that's, I think, if you're a policymaker, you're going, oh goodness, that's a problem. That's a potential problem. What do I do about that? Okay, so now a little bit on Germany. I was looking for a robot picture for German car manufacturing. I came up with the German manufacturing company that has been bought by the Chinese. It's a very famous one. It's still here. It's one of the major robot producers in the world. It's currently owned by the Chinese. So in any event, Germany today, I already said, full employment, there's shortages of skilled labor, wages are rising. By almost all indicators of the quantity and quality of employment, Germany is outperforming the OECD. You guys have a labor market you can be proud of in many respects. Certainly outperforms the OECD, significantly outperforms the US. The OECD has a dashboard, And the dashboard compares countries on certain indicators about the quantity of employment, the quality of employment, and the inclusiveness of employment. And if you go down this, you'll see that in the quantity of employment, Germany outperforms the OECD and the US significantly, except in one area. It has a higher percentage of jobs at risk of automation. And I would say the reason for that is because it still has a significantly higher share of jobs in manufacturing. Okay, the manufacturing employment as a share of total employment in Germany is higher than the OECD average. It's higher than the US by a substantial margin. So those jobs are at risk. Earnings quality, high wage economy, higher than the US. Interestingly enough, for those of you who say Germans work very hard, the measure of job strain is one area where Germany doesn't perform quite as well. The surveys of workers say, God, our jobs are very stressful. So job strain. I'm going to look at low income rate because I think this is really important. This is the share of working adults who earn income less than the median. Less than the median. Okay, so that's you're less than, actually it's not just less than the median, it's less than 2/3 of the median. So these are jobs that are not high paid jobs, and that rate is high for Germany and has been increasing over time. So one of the problems for Germany is the labor market is healthy, but the share of workers caught in earnings that are less than 2/3 of the median is high and has been rising. And I'll just point out the other one where Germany doesn't quite do as well is the gender labor income gap. So I've done a lot of work on gender issues for the UN and the World Economic Forum. Germany doesn't usually look up that well there. The gaps in employment, the gaps in wages by gender are bigger in Germany. But Germany, I said, has a lot to be proud of in terms of its current labor market. This just shows something that actually is related to gender. This is 1986, 2017, 2000. See what's happened here. I said that there's been an increasing share of the workers earning less than 2/3 of the median wage. Some of that is coming from the fact that there's a growing share of part-time. And it's not happening in the OECD. It's not happening in the US. It's happening in Germany. And then if you look at it and break down by gender, you can see what's really happening here, because this is largely a female part-time work economy. The male part-time work is just like the OECD. The female share of part-time is higher. So if I were doing a gender study here, I would focus on all of these. We've already talked about this. That's just a job polarization. The same chart I showed you earlier with all of those other countries. So 11.9% decline in the share of the working population in middle skills, a 10.4% increase in the share of the population in high skill, and a little increase in the bottom. This just shows you, remember I mentioned that one of the things that happens in technological change is skill bias technological change, is that labor productivity growth outstrips wage growth. Okay, wages don't stay consistently growing because more of the productivity, you can think about it this way, more of the productivity gains are being captured by the capitalists, by capital. They're not being captured by labor, except maybe that top 3%. We saw that earlier. Okay, so this just shows you that. The blue solid line is GDP per capita, which is productivity measure, and the dotted line is the compensation per hour, and that's a wage measure. So you can see the growing gap. This is not a macro talk, so I won't really talk. If I were doing this with the Bundesbank, we would all be focused on this diagram, which is essentially unit labor costs, because unit labor costs and the exchange rate are very important to the competitiveness of German industry. So that would be another thing we could talk about. Finally, I mentioned that technological change tends to be associated with increasing income and wage inequality, at least at the beginning. Part of it, the income inequality might be the share of capital versus the share of labor. The wage inequality tends to be that the high-skilled are having an increase in demand for their skills and occupations from the technology. The low skilled are having not that the technology is taking out some of their jobs, so that you'd expect that their wage growth would not be nearly as strong. And so in Germany, you can kind of see the middle skill, the 50th percentile. You can see the 10th percentile. You can see the 90th. You'd see similar charts like this for the other advanced industrial countries. I want to confess right now that I don't understand all of this. So, for example, I cannot explain, and I've been asking labor economists around here, why did the 10th percentile start doing much better around 2011? Okay, I'll leave that to you. I have had various answers given to me, and so far I'm not convinced. So that's an issue. Because you remember, I'm going to talk about it in a minute, the minimum wage in Germany wasn't introduced till 2015. Okay, so it's important. It's an important development in Germany to have a minimum wage, 2015. But this occurs during the recovery from the Great Recession. Anyway, I want to indicate things I really don't know. This is MGI estimates for Germany. I've gone through some of these, but again, just let me summarize here. Assuming a moderate pace of automation, the prediction for Germany from MGI, nothing to worry about. The prediction of trendline growth in things like consumer spending, infrastructure spending, spending on the healthcare for the elderly, spending on education. You just trend those out at current trends. There'll be enough jobs. There'll be enough jobs because the labor force is declining in size anyway. And so the trend is trend demand with declining labor supply. So even though there'll be disruption and change in occupations and job polarization and all the rest, there isn't a concern about employment. By the way, that's not true in the United States. In the United States, the trend line for demand is insufficient. So they're projecting by 2030 for the U.S., there would be technological unemployment. Again, it's in the process of getting to the long run, but 2030 is not quite the long run. Anyway, so if you think about it from Germany's point of view, you have enough demand to maintain full employment. A third of the workforce may have to switch occupations. That's a lot. A third of the workforce switching occupations is a lot. Employment and wage polarization likely to continue. Employment in the bottom 2/3 of the wage distribution is likely to fall. That was my 20 to 80, while share in the top 1/3 is likely to increase. Now, the next part says the demand for workers with less than a secondary education is likely to fall, while the demand for workers with an education that is tertiary or advanced degree is likely to increase. I want to point out that this is very misleading statement for Germany, because when you're trying to do an international comparison of Germany, you can't figure out where to put apprenticeships. Okay. So I would say that actually the demand for workers with a college education, appropriate apprenticeship, or appropriate advanced degrees will rise. I'm quoting McKinsey here, but my adjustment is you have to put apprenticeships. They are likely to rise, if it's the right design of the apprenticeship program. And again, we've already made this point, the most likely to succumb are routine cognitive and routine physical jobs. Things that a machine can just do better, faster. Okay. Probably already used up all my time, so I'm quickly, how am I doing? Nobody's keeping time for me.
It's 1:26.
Okay. And what time is this? What time am I supposed to stop talking? Now? 10 minutes ago. All right. Okay. All right. So I'm going to talk about just some policy issues briefly, and then we can talk about any of them in detail. Okay. When I came to Germany and when I came to this study a few years ago, I was particularly interested in how is technology affecting wage inequality and income inequality. I have actually become much more interested in a policymaker and what can policymakers do given the changing technology to generate good jobs for the majority of workers. So there's now a definition that's basically been, the OECD's worked on this, MGI's worked on this, and the World Economic Forum. There's a definition of what a good job is. And the question is, what can policymakers and institutions do to sort of generate these kinds of jobs, just as the change in occupation and the change in technology, just as all that stuff is going on, but you want to make sure that the jobs themselves have these aspects, okay? So earnings level, legal protection level, social protection level, representation of workers, very important, because remember I said that in a lot of the technology space, you have very, very powerful platform, large companies that have a huge amount of market power, and they have two kinds of market power. They have it vis-a-vis their consumers, they have it vis-a-vis their workers. They have it vis-a-vis their workers. So there's a lot of concern now in the U.S., and I've heard the concerns voiced here as well, that we've got to give workers some ability to fight against the monopsony power, the power of the concentrated companies as buyers of labor, So all of those things. And I will say one other thing here, because it's a nice term to introduce, and you may hear more of this over time. In the U.S. and somewhat here, in thinking about the policy areas to create good jobs, people say, well, one thing we could do is just redistribute the income at the very top through the population. We could do universal basic income. We could basically tax the rich, tax the wealthy, collect a lot of money, redistribute the income in terms of here's some basic income for you, you, and you. That is redistribution. There is predistribution. Are there policies that from the very beginning, as you enter the workforce, give the worker more claim over some of the benefits from productivity, from the technology, more claim, so that more goes to the labor share of income and less to the capital share of income? Are there things we can do? So predistribution has to do with influencing the share of labor in total returns in the marketplace, and redistribution has to do with after that's all occurred, you're going to redistribute income around. Okay, so I am focusing here largely on predistribution and policies in Germany. Since I'm going to run out of time here, I'm going to sort of say what we have been looking at. First of all, I just have to say as an economist that the German labor market is very strong right now. Yes, it is. The U.S. labor market is very strong. It was not in good shape back in 2008, 2009, 2010. If you have a failed macroeconomic policy agenda, you have inadequate aggregate demand, either because of too much fiscal constraint, too much monetary policy constraint, too much in general constraint, that is going to be the ultimate factor that drives the labor market. That is the ultimate factor that drives the labor market. So I have to assume, for my arguments, which have to do with technological change and sectoral change and structural change, I have to assume the right macroeconomic environment. If you get it wrong, that's that labor market effect. Tax on capital versus tax on labor. So Germany, all of the advanced industrial countries, including the U.S., tax in a way which there's a whole lot of taxes associated with employment that the employer pays or the worker pays. And that increases the cost of using a human as opposed to the cost of using a non-human. Okay? Germany is pretty much a standout here. Germany has a very high share of tax on labor as a share of their overall taxation, and a very low share of tax on capital as a share of overall taxation. So the German tax system itself is actually encouraging labor-saving automation. It's cheaper. Okay. So we could talk about tax. We could talk about education and skills. Apprenticeships, very important here. I think Germany, one of the reasons that Americans are very interested in Germany is the apprenticeship system, which is largely viewed to be success and largely viewed as something that might become very important as we think about occupational change and skill change going forward. So education and skills, labor market tools, I mentioned the minimum wage. Social protections. There are lots of workers. You saw that one chart about the increasing percentage of workers in part-time employment. A lot of those workers are in non-standard work. They're working on contracts. They're working through placement organizations. They're working for platforms. They don't have a long-term stable employer. And because so many protections in Germany, in the advanced industrial countries, and certainly in the U.S. are tied to stable employment patterns, those kinds of workers, we got to figure out a way to give them good jobs by providing them those kinds of protections. How do you do it? How do you reshape your policies? Institutions for Labor Voice in the U.S., a lot of interest in the collective bargaining approaches in Germany, and a lot of interest in works councils. So works councils, I'm trying to find out as much as I can about them. So anybody here who has some suggestions for me. In business schools and in among many U.S. scholars I know, looking at the effects of the adoption of technology in a workplace, have observed that the productivity or efficiency effects of the technology depend very much on redesigning the organizational structure, redesigning the work process, redesigning human resources, training your workers with the skills to use the technology. In Germany, works councils have a right, and seem to, at least in the large firms, have a role to play in all of this. So they're actually helping the company with the management think through, okay, well, if we're going to use this algorithmic or this supply chain structure driven by technology in this part of the process, what are the skills for the workers who are there? How do we design the process? And the evidence suggests that when you do it that way, you get better effects. You actually get more productivity. You get more profitability. It actually works better to wed the existing competencies and skills of your workforce with the technology. And I'm going to fault business schools here. I don't know if this is true at ESMT, but I will assure you that I've been dean of 2 business schools. The students studying to be managers, and therefore you would think would want to be concerned with things like organizational design. They hate organizational behavior classes. They hate human resources classes. What they really like is financial classes. They like to figure out, well, what's the rate of return from adopting this technology? So I think we as business schools, I'm now speaking for a minute as business schools, need to do a whole lot more to tell students, if you are going to manage a company effectively in this period of technological change, you have to care a lot about organizational design and about human resources. Anyway, and then dialogues among social partners. The concept of a social partner in the United States doesn't exist. Okay, if I've said social partners sometimes and then they kind of look at me and go, who are they? What do you mean by that? But they're very important in Germany in terms of the conversations going on about the adoption of technology with the workers. In the U.S., to the extent it's there at all, it's this interest in corporate social responsibility and the firms saying we've got to worry more about our talent base and our training and stuff like that. All right, so I'm not going to have time, but I'm happy to talk about any of these. So right now I've been doing a deep dive in understanding the apprenticeship system in Germany, understanding the minimum wage, understanding collective bargaining, understanding works councils. And one little aside on the minimum wage. 2015, this was a big break, a significant break with German economic policy. The government had no role up until the minimum wage in setting wages at all. This were negotiations, contracts, strikes, collective bargaining, employer associations sitting down with unions, and talking about the wage. The problem was that for the growing share of that, remember I showed you the growing share of the low-income workers in total employment. Those workers had no unions. There wasn't any. There were no employers associations. There wasn't any way to try to affect to put a floor on the wages of those workers. So the minimum wage is a very important phenomena for Germany. And actually, it's really interesting for the U.S. because it has not reduced employment. There's no evidence that it's reduced employment. It has actually increased the wages significantly of those at the bottom, and those in the bottom 2 deciles of the wage distribution. So not just at the very bottom, but through, say, the 20th percentile. It's had a big effect for women. It's had a big effect for migrants, for East Germans living in West Germany now. I mean, that unification is over, but it isn't over if you look at some of the wage data. So minimum wage is very important. And I think since I'm happy to answer questions about any of these. Got a nice picture here. It is certainly the case that trade union membership, not just in Germany, but throughout the OECD, has dramatically declined. It has dramatically declined. And collective bargaining coverage, the coverage of workers by a collective bargaining agreement, has also dramatically declined. There are many factors behind this. The fact that it's common to all advanced industrial countries suggests it's not just, in the German case, unification had an effect because the degree of unionization, collective bargaining, was lower in the eastern regions than the west. But there's got to be some common things going on here. And just to show you a nice chart, this chart shows that union agreements do generate faster growth than the rest of compensation. They pull up compensation. So remember that gap between the rate of growth of productivity and the rate of growth of wages. So the top line, rate of growth of productivity, the green line, the rate of growth of compensation, and then the wage growth by unions. You can see the unions are getting more wage growth and they're pulling along the rest of the wage growth. So that's, I think, important. I won't talk about works councils. I want to start, I just will in passing here. So one of the things that I have the honor to work with here is BMAS, which is the Ministry of Labor and Social Affairs. And they're doing a lot to try to deal with good jobs, the creation of good jobs under an environment of changing technology. They're doing a lot in lifelong learning and skills upgrade. They're doing a lot in helping the federal employment agencies become much better career counselors. And this is really interesting, my skills. So in the future, an employment agency in the US or in Germany, where employment agencies in Germany are used a lot, you could actually go while you're working and do an assessment of your basic competencies and skills and try to figure out, well, what kind of occupation, am I in the right occupation? Do I want to move? Do I want to get some additional training? So there's a lot that the technology itself can do to actually help you assess your skills and then match you. In the U.S., that tends to be done largely by LinkedIn. LinkedIn is a private company, and you pay for the services. In Germany, you can do it in LinkedIn, but the federal government is also involved in that. They're working on changes in working with, in this case, employer associations and works councils to think about, well, how do you redesign the work organization? I really like this idea. You can as an employer group, as a company, you can come and work with BMAS to get money to support an innovation space to kind of think about, well, how do you redesign this part of the work process, given that I'm now going to absorb this technology? So I think that's great. Minimum wage I talked about. There's a pension reform. There's other things that BMAS is doing that we'll be following over time. Here's my conclusions. Automation on labor markets, they're not predetermined in the sense that ultimately this is going to depend upon policy. It depends on institutions like labor. It depends on institutions like apprenticeship. It depends upon politics, obviously. And it depends upon societal norms of justice and fairness. What is the appropriate level of CEO pay relative to the median worker? This is a huge discussion in the United States. It's about a norm, a social norm. So I like to say that the machines are very intelligent. They're in many ways more intelligent than humans, but they are not intelligent at making intelligent policies. So intelligent policies, we need intelligent humans to deal with the effects of intelligent machines on employment. So let me stop there, and happy to take a little more time of your time if you'd like to answer some questions.
Well, thank you so much for this compelling talk, which puts me in a dilemma, which is that I wrote down so many questions that we wouldn't have the time to actually address those.
The slides are available.
That's great. That's great. And let me just warn you, if I ask an odd question, I'm a political scientist, so bear with me. Also, I'm trying to refrain from the temptation of asking these 20 questions in a conflated question, but nonetheless, to break the ice and to give you some time, maybe to articulate a question of your own and to open up afterwards. Let me just ask two questions. One of them is, you've argued from the perspective of the task itself,
of the task.
From the routine task and the wages that are implied.
Right.
And that's the standard economist's perspective on the individual. Now, let me cite someone from 250 years back, which is not normally often done. Adam Smith, who reminds us of the extent of labor and the market, right, for specialization.
Yes.
And we seem to be seeing major shifts at the moment. The story you've told us is more about an extrapolation of globalization in the future under specific conditions. But aren't we seeing certain tendencies right now which go beyond Trump, but where Trump is the most important figure at this point in time, where we see a turn away from globalization and deepening globalization processes, which is also not just a political phenomenon of neo-mercantilism and protectionism, but also a necessity for proximity to market and for new types of global production networks. So what does this shift imply for the story that you're telling us? The second question is, I think, related to that. You underlined the necessity of policy. You gave us an account that that's not techno-deterministic,
that you can affect it. There's the direction, but there are lots of ways to contain it or moderate it, or that's what I would say.
Right. So institutions matter, and obviously, as a political scientist, I would agree.
Yes.
But the institutions that were important in the 19th and 20th century don't exist anymore. I mean, if you look at labor, you showed us the numbers of deunionization. In many ways, the emergence of the welfare state was coupled to a specific type of work and a specific type of national economy. To the railroad economy, basically, and certain types of communication and transportation infrastructures. They all transcend the national scale. So are the policy solutions that you're suggesting something that can operate at the national scale? Or is there does there need to be an upscaling of the political level in order to map onto these global processes that we're facing?
Well, just as countries are moving away from global process, you want to map them. So I just saw, related to the minimum wage in Germany. So Germany has now, it's going to be the president of the council, the EU council. And one of the things they want to put on the agenda is a framework for minimum wage for the entire European community, because it's very complicated for a major player as big as Germany to basically add minimum wage. And there are other countries, but there's not a common one. And there's not a common process for changing it over time, and you could erode your competitive position. So that's just one example. So on the first point about globalization, I think you could argue that for big economies, and Germany is a big economy, and so is the U.S., Germany right now is much more dependent on exports than an economy of its size usually is. So it is quite possible for me to imagine that Germany could bring stuff out of the supply chain back. They didn't move as much out as the U.S. did. So the U.S. moved much more of its supply chain out than Germany ever did. Germany moved it a little east. So I understand, there's the Czech part of the supply chain and the Polish part of the supply chain. So they moved it a little, but it still is deeply embedded here. So I don't think that walking away from, I think the risk to Germany from the walking away from globalization around the world is Germans' export markets. That is very important. But I think that you could imagine that as a large economy, it can generate a lot of the kinds of jobs of the future that we talked about will be jobs in Germany for Germans. So that's how I would handle your first question. I think the biggest danger actually is to smaller economies who are much more dependent on global markets. And so if there really is a move to more national protectionist markets, they will be more badly hit. And also the technology interaction with the globalization. This was a major way. If you look at the development of China, which has been dramatic, and if you look at China back in 1989 to say 2005, that was basically driven by supply chain development, increasingly through technology, enabled through technology. But I think that latecomers to industrialization now are going to have a very hard. I don't think that pathway is open to them. I don't think that pathway of technology-enabled supply chain industrialization is likely to be the trajectory for economic development in Africa, because a lot of the stuff can be, as you said, produced nearby at home. You don't need to do it anymore. Mm-hmm. So I think what was the other question? The other question
was about the institutions, about the state. I mean, you seem to be insinuating from the last section that the state has a role as a market fixer mostly, and trying to smoothen the process or the frictions in the process. But isn't there perhaps also a vision of a much more active government?
Yes. So yes, there is, and I guess I think that. Again, I mentioned in passing, but one of the things that attracted me to be here in Germany was that even despite the kind of weakening of the institutions, you still have, IG Metall, they did something really interesting a couple of years ago. They said, for the self-employed, they're not part of our union. You can be part of our union. Okay, we're going to say there are a growing number of workers in non-standard contract forms, platform forms. They have no representation. You can be part of us, and they are working on policies now with some other major unions in Austria and I think Austria and Sweden. Same thing. Let's think about how we can organize platform workers to have more collective negotiations with employers to get good jobs. So that's I think it's a development of an institution. I do think there's been erosion, but I think there's interesting new innovation going on. The Works Council of Siemens, where I was just talking to someone from that Works Council, they have two really interesting funds that are internal, a fund for innovation and a fund for the future, where actually, and the Works Councils are actually quite involved in both making proposals to these funds, but also they evaluate proposals. And they're sort of thinking about, on the Fund for the Future, it is all about skill development and apprenticeships and organization of people in the firm to work with the technology. So let me say my optimism is innovation around existing institutions. I'll give you one final one. When I first came, and I met my main contact at the Ministry of Labor, he was talking about how he had been asked by some of the employers in the retail sector to meet with some of the parts of Verdi, which is the union that represents, and it's a kind of hodgepodge of services, but it includes retail workers. So to have them come together and talk about the implications of online internet transactions for traditional employment and traditional retail, and that came as a social dialogue. I can't even imagine that happening in the U.S. So I think that's an innovation of an existing institution. So my optimism is that.
All right.
Okay.
And maybe tied to that, I mean, the logistics sector, before I really open up,
yes,
is very much tied to space.
Yes.
The notion that these jobs need to happen in proximity,
right,
I think, gives some leverage to certain discussions that,
yes, exactly,
for a long time when we talked about globalization as this cloud that is just out there,
right,
weren't possible. So.
Right. And logistics also is interesting because of the issues now for Germany posed by Amazon wanting to do all of the delivery services itself as part of its organization, as opposed to actually employ existing German companies who move these things around. That's a very interesting that's an issue where you actually have discussion about it at the national level. I mean, again, we would never have such a discussion at the national, not even at the state level would we have such a discussion in the United States. So, because it would be the choice of the companies. I mean, it's
right.
Yeah.
But it has so many ripple effects for transportation costs and for other industries, which
I agree.
is often neglected. So let's open up the debate for the last couple of minutes that we have, and please make sure to talk into the microphone, I was told. So there's a question up here.
Thanks very much for a fascinating discussion. One question actually building on what you were just talking about, which did occur to me, is also looking at the evolution of unions, but against other social organizations, because political party membership is declining, and it just struck me it would be an interesting exercise to map whether there are actually correlations here.
Right.
Because the interesting thing is, and this goes into other wider issues, that I think what you see in politics at the moment is a kind of breakdown in which people want to be more interactively involved in how their politics runs. So, in terms of the role of works councils, for example, I mean, how workers will engage with works councils is obviously a fascinating thing to get into. I think the other question which I wanted to raise is you mentioned a European minimum wage. The other issue which is discussed in the European context is European unemployment insurance. And in the context of designing a system that kind of bridges this dip. I mean, one of our ministers had this wonderful statistic to say that 200 years ago, half the population were involved in agriculture. Now it's 1%. We got from there to here, but a lot happened.
A lot happened in between. That's right. Yes, we got that's yes.
Okay.
Okay.
I haven't got a lot of time. I'll stop there.
Right. So I think that I was shocked by the extent to which the unemployment insurance coverage throughout the OECD is actually quite low. The time you get to have the insurance and the amount of insurance as a share of the wage you gave up, they are not particularly robust policies. I think that one of the things, of course, in Germany, I mentioned the unification as one issue that kind of affects the aggregate statistics. Obviously, the Hartz reforms also reflects the aggregate statistics. And that was actually meant to make the benefits of unemployment less generous, because the view was that people were sitting in unemployment because the economic incentive was to stay in unemployment, because the low wage alternative was not as attractive as the unemployment. So the complication here is figuring out a way to both ease the cost of the transition, but not impede the pace of the transition, if you will, and to link it with, and that's why all of these, I couldn't go through them in detail, but labor market policies which are actively involved with the Ministry of Labor giving advice to the unemployed. There's now counseling. It can be before you're unemployed. You're just thinking about your career. Okay, I have this apprenticeship. I'm thinking about my career. I need to assess my skills using this new skill tool that you're going to put online. I need to understand all of the training opportunities in Germany through the federal government can help provide that kind of support. So I think there was a lot of interest some years ago, and I think it still is a term which is used throughout the OECD. So the countries which do this best, their models are called flexicurity. And so Denmark is an example where essentially it's a pretty generous unemployment compensation, but it's also a very active policy to move you along, to basically find another job for you, to move you, to skill you if you need to. There's not, the security part of it is not, does not mean a lack of flexibility. So I think you have to design these things right. And then there's also the issue, just by the way, of a lot of unemployment, and Germany handled this pretty well, can just be because you have a tremendous hit on the macro economy. So, yeah. So good macroeconomic policies could also help a lot. Right. Yeah.
Thank you for being here, and thank you for your presentation. I would be interested in knowing your point of view on an aspect of labor taxation following a statement made by Bill Gates in 2017. And okay. I quote Bill Gates, right now, the human worker who does, say, $50,000 of work, worth of work in a factory, that income is taxed, of course. Yeah. And if a robot comes in to do the same thing, you think that we tax the robot at a similar level. So do you think that robotic labor taxation makes sense so that those taxes could be used for funding labor force retraining, or, as the point was previously raised, unemployment insurance? Thanks.
So I tend to not favor a robot tax because I think that I do believe that the technology is ultimately productivity enhancing and that we shouldn't slow the productivity down. We need to think about the best ways to distribute the benefits of the productivity. So my notion would be the robot tax is just a way of trying to impede the use of that technology. So why not instead you could reduce some of the way you collect taxes so that it's not so much on employment. As I mentioned, that's a very high share of overall taxation in Germany. You could I thought in a sense Bill Gates has also talked about the other sort of problem in U.S. taxes in general, which is that the tax rate at the very top, income tax rate, ends up to be lower than the tax rate at those in the mid. Even though it's supposed to be a progressive tax system, once you take all of the ways of sort of all the credits you can take as a wealthy person, you end up paying not very much. As your rate is lower. So I am more in favor of looking at other things we could do in the tax system than I am in a robot tax. I would say I'm more in favor of just a very small tax on financial transactions. I don't know why we didn't go there. You can collect a whole lot of money with a very small tax on financial transactions. You could collect a lot of money and pursue an important agenda, although politically very complicated, if you had a more serious carbon tax. And that a carbon tax is the right thing to do from the point of view of the environment. It raises a lot of money. It causes yellow vests. So I'll leave. But I would say, and then finally, for Bill Gates and others, I think that all of the advanced industrial countries have been harmed by the fact that these global companies can go around the world and find places where they pay virtually no tax on their corporate income. So there are lots of things one could do to handle the stateless tax policy problem, which would mean that there would be more tax revenue collected from these corporations by nations, which could then use it to invest in things like education. But right now they've figured out ways to keep that tax very low by moving their returns around the world to low tax environments.
Yes, I would address the issue. You still treat each country as a closed national economy, more or less, which you compare. Mm-hmm. But in a globalized economy, we have global value chains.
Yes, we do.
I think Germany was very successful to restructure its global value chains in a way that it was outsourcing, offshoring a lot of low-cost production, which they cannot compete, and probably much better than other countries, and that gives them a comparative advantage to keep high wage payments even in the middle income class, because it's a mixed calculation in the value chain, where Germany is probably the dominant player in certain value chains, like in
autos and in machine tools and automobiles, for sure. For machine tools and automobiles. I don't disagree with anything that you said. I mean, I don't even think it's, I wouldn't make a distinction between that. All I would say there is I think that the technology in general enables that kind of outsourcing to work smoothly because of the computerization and supply chain management and all things you need to do to run a tightly knit supply chain in several different locations. So technology enables it, is all I would say. Yeah, I think globalization, I think there's a debate about the extent to which it is technology or globalization or the two working together that explains things like outsourcing. And what happens to low-wage labor in a costly economy like Germany. Costly meaning it's for the work done here, it's high-wage work. So yeah, I don't disagree with that. I don't disagree with that. I think, there's a very interesting study, and you may know it. It's a very nice study I ran across here, and then I've run across it again and again, by a number of economists who did it. It was in something called the Journal of Economic Perspectives, which is a very good journal. And it's called Germany from Sick Man to Superstar of Europe or something like that. And what they argue is, this is what they argue, and they have some really good data to back it up. They say, okay, here along comes unification. The German powerful firms in the West go, we've got to figure out how we can get control of our own costs and outsource to the East, to the eastern regions of Germany and then to Czechoslovakia and Poland and all the rest. We've got to go to the workers and say, for a while, you're going to have to exercise wage restraint. If you do that, we'll be able to compete in this new environment and your jobs will be secure. But you need to understand, you're an insider in the firm. You won't be an insider if we're going to outsource all of this, okay? We won't outsource as much if you exercise wage constraint. And they did. They actually did. And then you see a lot at that time for several years, a lot of the firms in the West basically opted out. There were opt-out or escape clauses in agreements with unions, and they sort of all chose opting out, and they basically went to. So you can see a very clear pattern. And then what remains here is actually, as you said, it's high wage, and there's outsourcing, and there's this wonderful supply chain which now goes through Germany to the east. Right. Yeah. Great.
Hi, thank you for the talk. In your concluding words, you said that we need people because machines can't really produce good policies. And my question is that actually true? Like right now we already have like some AI technology combined with big data that can actually run through scenarios of different things, including policy measures that can predict their effectiveness, and that's probably only going to increase in terms of sophistication going forward. So my question is, can we actually rely on people and not machines going forward?
So I would say that you're asking the machine not to design the policy. So you might say to the machine, okay, my goal is to raise the wage growth in the bottom 2 deciles of the workforce. Do a bunch of scenario analysis and tell me, and I suggest a minimum wage. Yeah, the models can actually do a really good job of sort of saying, okay, I think there would be employment effects here and there wouldn't be employment effects there. The effects on women would be different from the effects on men. Yeah, I think it's a tool. I think the humans are the ones that set the social or political or economic goals, not the machines. And then the machines actually can help the humans with those goals design good policies. That maybe that's it. I still believe that the goal setting is with the humans.
To piggyback on this question and maybe also to close it because our time is pretty much up, I would like to ask you, because I won't ever get the chance again, I fear, what your take is on Mazzucato's view of technological change. So maybe we should shift our understanding.
You should tell everybody what her view is. I know her view.
Right. So Mazzucato's understanding is that we distort what entrepreneurs really do by thinking that they invent something in the garage as geniuses and then everything else has to change. It's a very Schumpeterian view of technological
Yes, it's a very
innovation.
Schumpeterian view.
And so she says, well, in fact, if you look at the iPhone, she does this a bit gimmicky, but I think very powerful statement in the beginning of her talks where she says all the technology that makes the iPhone a smartphone and not a dumb phone is technology that was basically developed by the state in the Cold War context.
Yep.
So maybe we have to think of technological innovation as something that has a collective and very strong state component in it, and therefore think about redistribution in different ways. And you mentioned predistribution in passing, and so I would just like to hear your thoughts on this idea.
Okay, so I, in my work, in my life, have done a lot of work on industrial policy, and I actually agree with her. I mean, I do think if you look at the major technological breakthroughs, so the U.S. position in first the computer revolution and now the AI digital revolution ongoing, and in biotechnology, if you look at the source of the basic science there, it's all federally funded. And actually, a lot of the professors and their graduate students who went on to start these things were all federally funded. And federal funding for R&D in the United States comes in two forms primarily. One is for health, and the other is for defense. So almost all of the ICT, machine tool, digital stuff started in the Defense Department related to defense. And I agree with her. And you would say that from a basic science point of view, government's support of basic science makes sense because it's not that close to the marketplace. Nobody knew when they were developing the things that became social networking that social networking existed as a product. It wasn't applied research, it was basic research. So I like it. We need to have the governments do this. Then the question really becomes, are there this is the harder question. Could you imagine the governments, including the US, say, I'm going to try to fund basic science in such a way that it generates good jobs? This is a concept that actually an MIT economist who's very famous now in this space, Darren Acemoglu, he has said, I've been on a panel with him, he said the big challenge for us is to try to figure out how we would even design such an R&D program, because the R&D programs that exist have nothing to do with the employment effects. They don't even take them into account. So maybe we can. I'm leaving that as a possibility. Okay.
I think that's a great final remark. So thank you so much, Laura. Thank you so much for your questions. And maybe we have some time to speak informally afterwards.
Sure.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much.